Now I got a couple of federal examples for you. This is our federal progressives. We get two progressive presidents. They're really famous presidents. There's Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Progressive in that they are willing to have a new role for the government in the economy. And this is Theodore Roosevelt. We've talked about him before with imperialism. He ran as vice president in 1900 with McKinley. McKinley gets assassinated in the summer of 1901, and Roosevelt takes over. In 1902, he gets faced with his first national crisis. There's a strike going on. On your ID list, I call it the anthracite coal strike. It wouldn't be such a big deal except for the coal companies have formed into a trust. A large percentage of the coal production in America is under this one company, which operates in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee. So this big company that owns all these mines have consolidated. Anybody want to work in a mine? How'd you like to work in a mine 100 years ago? Right? Not a good thing. So they have cave-ins, they've got bad conditions, they risk their lives in there, and they get paid a little bit of money. And the owners don't really care about them, do they? I mean, when it comes down to it. So the miners want a contract with the company. And they want this contract to lay out how much they'll get paid for the next 5 years and what they'll do about worker conditions. The mine company says, no, thank you. We're not going to work with you guys as a contract with the union. And so the miners strike. And the owners say, fine, we'll just find replacement workers. Which would be kind of hard to do, but they think they can do it. Well, the owners have a problem. The miners have some leverage on them in stopping replacement workers. What would you do if you're a miner in a remote part of West Virginia and you knew they were going to bring in replacement workers? What could you do to stop the replacement workers from coming in?
Tell them
what?
Like spread rumors about what bad place.
How could you literally stop them from arriving at the mine? In a way that would keep you from being arrested, maybe. You could drop trees over these little roads going up there, right? You could block the railroad. You could block the outflow of coal, too. And that's what ends up happening. Miners start actively intervening in this strike. So this is a large labor dispute, and the laborers have kind of getting the upper hand, but they're really able to put some pressure on the companies. Now, the companies, you've seen this in the Homestead strike, right? By the way, my students are having a hard time with the Homestead strike and the Pullman strike. The Homestead strike is in Pennsylvania, and it's at one of Carnegie's places. And that's when the governor of Pennsylvania sent troops in, when the Pinkertons lost control of that factory. And then we had the Pullman strike in Chicago, and that's when the governor of Illinois would not intervene in the strike. And so Cleveland sent in federal troops. Well, we have a strike again, and the owners ask Teddy Roosevelt to send in federal troops to protect the approaches to the mines and to arrest the union workers who were dropping trees and disrupting things. Teddy Roosevelt probably could have done that, but he understands that things are changing and that America needs to change, and so he does something dramatic. He won't side with the company owners directly. Here's a cartoon which kind of suggests his position. This says strike district. Here's the strikers. They won't talk to the owners. And this is an image here. Y'all know who this is? I think you've heard of him. He's an iconic figure. Uncle Sam. Now, we use Uncle Sam when we have a crisis. When's the time we most traditionally use Uncle Sam?
Election.
And wars, right? Uncle Sam wants you to come out. So it's a patriotic issue. It's when society needs to make a demand on an individual. Does Uncle Sam look happy here? He's got his hat off. His posture is, this says the freezing public. He's mad at both of them, kind of. He wants them to get their act together because they're not going to get coal in the cities, and the price of coal is going to skyrocket, and there's going to be people freezing to death. And there'll be businesses impacted by it. So here's what I want you to know at the end of it here. He threatens to intervene, but he says, I'm not going to pick sides. I'm just going to nationalize the mines. I'm going to run these mines and sell the product. And is that going to make the mine owners happy? No. So he says, here's what I want y'all to do. I want the labor union to send representatives to Washington. And I want the mine owners to send representatives to Washington. And I'm going to set up an arbitration. We're going to sit you guys down in a couple rooms. And we're going to go over the issues which separate you. And we need to come up with a solution. What I want you to know, this is a dramatic shift in the history of the United States because we have a president for the first time who is trying to force an accommodation between labor and capital and not simply siding with the capital class. That's dramatic. And he has a positive outcome. The union gets its contract. He tells them if he thinks they're getting a little bit too strong here on their... He also tells the owners that this is, really? Are you not willing to do these basic things? But of course, the owners didn't want to deal with unions at all because they were afraid that would ultimately force them to treat these people better. And that might intervene in their profits. All right. Another thing I want you to know is the Hepburn Act. Here's another political cartoon from the period. He's known as this really activist. He has a persona which he projects in America. He gets a gymnasium built in the White House downstairs. He's got a boxing match in there. He brings his cabinet officers there. Ambassadors who come to Washington. He's like, hey, do you box? And he'd also have them running around up in Rock Creek Park and swimming in rivers and stuff. He liked the vigorous outdoor life. He had archery on the lawn. He got there with his young kids. He was a young president. Well, now he's wrestling. That's supposed to be what, you suppose? Yep, railroads. He's going after the railroad monopolies. So far, government has not been able to constrain the railroad companies. Here's another idea that my students are struggling with. It says it was the first effort of the federal government to regulate an industry. In this case, railroads. Which ID is that? Close, but in this case, railroads. It was right before that. That's generally about trying to stop the combination. Do you have your ID list there? You might find it. Anybody else while we're looking?
Interstate commerce.
Interstate Commerce Act. Established the Interstate Commerce Commission. It had the right to tell companies that their rates were unfair. But remember, I told y'all before, it was just a big to-do to make the public think that they were actually going to do something to constrain railroad companies. But remember, I told you they could only strike down the rates. And it was a long list and there wasn't much money for it. So it was really just kind of a dog and pony show. So that was 1885. What is this, 20 years later? For the last 20 years, it's been an ineffective piece of legislation. And the American people finally figured out, this is a big game with them, right? They figured out how to get around it. So he decides, and this is another big moment in the history of political economy, the Hepburn Act strengthens the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Here's how it strengthens it. It gives them the power to not only strike down rates that they say are unfair, exorbitant means excessively high, but it gives the ICC the power to set what it believes a fair rate would be. Is that dramatic? This is a big intervention of society in the marketplace. So then they have to have a debate over what's a fair rate of return and how do we run all this? And how do we determine it? So we have to have lots of lawyers in there. We got lawyers for the public who are trying to establish fair rates, and you got lawyers for the railroad companies saying, no, these are our expenses, and our expenses are higher than what you're allowing for. This has really got to get the government agencies into the accounting offices of these places. Well, and the companies just think it's horrible, right? But again, they're not going to tell your barber how much they can charge you. They're not going to tell you how much somebody can charge at a restaurant for a T-bone steak. It's very specific. It's not socialism. Here's the big picture I want you to know. It's called the democratic regulated capitalist state. This is what's beginning to emerge. The democratic, so it's based on democracy. The democratic We retain private ownership of companies. Railroad companies are in private hands. We're not going to nationalize them. That would be socialism. And many countries that we know and love have done that. But we're going to simply regulate the way they do business. Now, company owners who don't want to be regulated are going to say, you're a bunch of socialists, right? What are you, communists? Tell us how we can run our business place. But that's, of course, the antidote. That's the pushback effort. That's Hepburn Act. He also has his Attorney General start prosecuting other companies under, as you mentioned, Tyler, the Sherman Antitrust Act. And he breaks up a famous one called Northern Securities. He forces them to break up into competing companies. Another big thing he does is the Pure Food and Drug Act. The meat packing companies in Chicago and Illinois, they wanted to do whatever they wanted to with the meat. They wanted to take the scraps after leaving them on the floor for I don't know how long, put some formaldehyde over them to hopefully kill the bacteria, and then cook it up and put it in a can and send it to the cities where poor people would buy them. Well, we've got people dying of botulism and E. coli. But the regulators in Illinois don't effectively intervene. Why? Well, because Mr. Swift doesn't want to have any state regulators coming in telling him what to do with his company, right? He's paid good money to the politicians to who are hiring the regulators. So the people of America are kind of getting frustrated with this process of businesses don't care about their consumers. And so this is, I guess you could say, it's the first consumer safety law. How about that? First consumer safety law under the federal government's jurisdiction, based on Interstate Commerce Clause. Interstate Commerce Clause was that clause in the federal Constitution of 1787 that said that only the federal government can regulate trade between the states. And so they're saying, okay, if we can, let's do it. So it puts a federal agent in these places, and it gives them standards that companies have to abide by in order for public safety. All right, it's the beginning. He also is our first environmentalist. He's not worried about greenhouse gases and things like that and controlling the amount of smog coming out of smokestacks. He's interested in how we deal with the public domain, how we deal with our national assets. We clear cut, this is a person down here somewhere, a person here. We clear cut the entire East Coast. All the trees we see around here are all second or third growth. The original forests, we cut them all down in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And now we moved out west. Now, you can buy 120 acres for how much? Remember the Homestead Act? Buy 120 acres for how much money? It was like $5? $5. So now they see these timber all over these western mountains. Now, if you're an individual, do you want to go out there and buy how are you going to deal with these trees? How are you going to get them all the way back to the East Coast and sell them for anything? Who can afford to do that? Only the capitalist class can do that, right? So the capitalist class begins to do that. They set up companies that go out and start buying $5 for 120 acres of trees. And then they bring in poor immigrant men to work on these trees. And here's what Roosevelt begins to think. By the way, he's standing in front of a redwood. That has a tree behind him, right? How long do these things take to grow? Like 500 years, right? And they're going to cut it down. And the only person making any money off of it, the guys who cut it down get paid cents per day. But the one running off with the money is the capitalist. And so the question begins to emerge for Teddy Roosevelt, is it really worth it to sell off all this, to just let all this land go into the capitalist class who doesn't really care about it? And should we not be conserving this stuff? This is called conservation. He's an environmental conservationist. So what does he do? He says we better set aside some of this land and say it will not be sold. And it will not be timbered. So what does he set up? What are some of our famous parks out there? Yellowstone. He's going to set up Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons in northern Wyoming and southern Montana. In California, he'll set up Yosemite. And in Alaska, he'll set aside public lands. Now today, the new one is petroleum companies wanting to go out into Alaska and places like that. But this is the start of it with his Forest Reserve Act of 1902. All right, Roosevelt finishes up 7 years. He finishes McKinley's first term, and then he goes in to a second term. People of America like him a lot. He was reelected, but now he's finished what looks like more or less 2 terms. And since George Washington only served 2 terms, every president has stood down after 2 terms. And so he thinks maybe he should leave. And so he handpicks a successor, and this guy's name is William Taft. Well, Taft ends up not being as progressive as Roosevelt and progressive Republicans thought. And a split takes place between progressive Republicans and conservative Republicans. And after about 2 years, he starts to think maybe I should come back and go ahead and run for my own second term. So he begins to argue maybe it looks like 3 terms, but really one of them was McKinley's. And some progressive Republican governors like La Follette and Governor Bass from New Hampshire would love to have him come back. So he actually starts making some speeches. I don't want to read the whole thing for you, but he basically says it's always been a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. By the way, is he a have or a have-not? Teddy Roosevelt. He's a have. He's a have in spades, man. He comes from wealth in New York. But he understands the populist mentality, the understanding that the capitalist class takes advantage of the average people. He says, in our day, it appears that the struggle for free men to gain and hold the right of self-government, to gain and hold it, right, as against the special interest. Special interests, these are the capitalist class, the corporations, who twist the methods of the free government into machinery for defeating the popular will. He's saying the political parties have been taken over by, especially the Republican Party, he says, has been taken over by the corporations who are using the party to create a machine to thwart the public will, like in New York with the Wainwright Commission, right? Things like that. So he says, how do we keep corporations out of the political parties? He says we need campaign finance reform. He says it is necessary that laws should be passed to prohibit the use of corporate funds directly or indirectly for political purposes. It is still more necessary that such laws should be thoroughly enforced. Corporate expenditures for political purposes, especially ones involving the public sector, have supplied one of the principal sources of corruption in our political affairs. So he early on realizes that the power of the corporate... By the way, American people are going to agree with him, right? They're saying, yes, thank you. Somebody who's going to restrain the power of the corporations in a democracy. Now today we would call this class warfare, right? He's saying that the haves, the capital class, are taking advantage of the have-nots through their control of political parties. So he decides to re-enter politics. First president to do this. He's going to run for president again in 1912. He goes up against his former friend William Taft, and they have a bitter campaign. But William Taft controls the party on a national basis. It's very close, but the Republican convention, when it meets in Chicago in 1912, Taft gets the nomination, even though it's not likely he could get reelected. Roosevelt's supporters are so upset that they break off, right? And they form the most famous third-party movement in American history called the Bull Moose Party, named for him. So now the Republicans are split between 2 candidates. Now the Democrats decide they'll put together up a progressive, because he's going to be pulling for Democrat progressives to come to him. Conservative Democrats don't like big government, but he knows there's a need for government in the economy. So the Democrats put forward a progressive leader in the name of Woodrow Wilson. Now, because the Republican vote is split, Wilson wins. He probably should not have become president except for this fight among the Republicans. But Wilson does... Okay, these are your 2 IDs here. New nationalism versus new freedom. I have to get you guys to get this straight on your test. This is probably one of the most important presidential elections in the history of the United States. They're both calling for new role for the government in intervening in the economy. The defining factor would be, what's our attitude towards big corporations? Woodrow Wilson, influenced by a guy named Louis Brandeis, decides all big businesses need to be broken up. We need to reinforce the Sherman Antitrust Act. We're going to break up companies so they've got to compete with one another. He says there are no every big business that ever emerged was from some kind of shenanigan, like predatory pricing. So New Freedom is the name of Wilson's program. We're going to get a new round of freedom for Americans by breaking the power of the corporations over our lives. Teddy Roosevelt's program is going to be called New Nationalism. He says, some big businesses have become big because of efficiency. They've used machinery in great innovative ways. We've got some really smart guys like Andrew Carnegie. His monopoly in the steel sector is a result of his innovation. He's got efficiencies. So Crowley and George Rubley, the advisors to Teddy Roosevelt, on my 10-minute discussion of this, they argue that we need to preserve the good big businesses that are efficient. There's no reason to break them up. If they run out of the marketplace smaller companies who are less efficient, then so be it. That's how it is. They also argue that, American businesses have to compete in Latin America against German cartels and Italian cartels, and same thing in India and in China. So we need these big businesses to help us in a global competitive economy. All right, well, Wilson ends up winning, but he does carry out a lot of his programs. I'd like you to know what Wilson does. I don't have the Underwood tariff. Do I have on there for you? The tariffs were to protect the manufacturers in America from foreign competition at the expense of the farmers. So he finally goes after that tariff and gets it reduced. That helps out the farmers in regard to their ability to sell to Europe at a better rate because there won't be retaliation. And also to pay lower prices for barbed wire and chemicals and fertilizers. It forces American companies to compete. He creates the Federal Reserve Act. I don't want to go into this a lot right now because A, I don't have time. But it's really just the beginning. It's the beginning of government regulation of the banking sector. Do you guys know what it says at the top of the dollar bill? All of ours? It says Federal Reserve Note. Our currency is issued by the Federal Reserve in coordination with the Mint. This is going to give a role for the government in overseeing the banking system to try to regulate it, and here's towards what end? More fair interest rates in America and less vulnerable banking system. It's got a lot to be built on later on. They've got to do a lot more to it. But this is the beginning of a role for the government in controlling the monetary supply. All right. Now, the next one is the Federal Trade Commission. Wilson ends up deciding not to break up all big businesses. He gets a lot of pushback in Congress. They're saying, we don't think you were thinking everything out in that campaign. And that guy, George Rubley, who was talking about earlier, Teddy Roosevelt's advisor, he was a good friend of Wilson's advisor. And Rubley comes to Washington and convinces, in a very interesting development, he ends up convincing Wilson to throw away the idea of breaking up all big businesses and instead to create a Federal Trade Commission, which has authority to stop mergers. Today we've got mergers going on. American Airlines and U.S. Air merged recently. Anybody even notice that? Y'all would have noticed it, right? We have companies merging. And what the Federal Trade Commission does is it asks the question, is this going to hurt the American consumer? Is it going to take competition out? And so they actually build a building downtown Washington. This is pretty close to the Capitol. And I like a monument they put outside of it. This is capitalism. Capitalism is this amazing, wonderful, dynamic beast that, if controlled properly, and maybe a plow put behind it or a wagon put behind it, then it can be useful to society. But it's got to have a strong arm to control this beast. So this is supposed to be, we need a stronger federal government that has the power to restrain business, and that's what the Federal Trade Commission becomes in America. So businesses are always pushing for all the benefits that they can possibly get for themselves, but society has created some institutions to try to safeguard individual public interest. I hope that all makes sense to you guys as you go forward. You kind of understand the system we live in. He also does things for farmers. Remember that 1892 Omaha platform for the People's Party and all those things they were wanting the government to help out with the farmers? This provides loans to farmers so that they can build silos and such, the Warehouse Act. A lot of people get messed up on this. Don't get the Wainwright Commission and the Workmen's Compensation Act. This is simply something that Wilson passes for federal workers. He creates a Workmen's Compensation Program for federal workers, where he forces them all to take part of the wages they're paid by the government and put it into an insurance fund so that if something happens to them, let's say they're working in the Forest Reserve and they get struck by lightning or something, they would have some money that would come to them. But really, what I would like you to know about this one is it's just him leading by example. He does not have the authority in 1916 to create a nationwide workmen's compensation agency. The authority simply is not there yet. The American people aren't ready for it. And there's too much pushback from businesses. But he can show that he's in favor of it by helping to get at least for what he can affect, which is federal workers. Another big one that we get is the Owen Keating Child Labor Act. We've got factories around America that are employing kids 12, 13 hours a day, as young as maybe 9 years old, working in a mine. Now, so far, the federal government has lacked the authority to, that's been a state issue, but the states haven't been dealing with it because the states are under the control of the corporations, right? So the question emerges, can the federal government do anything about that? And here's what they decide. Again, interstate commerce. They say, this is what the Owen Keating Act says. If you have a factory that produces products that leave the state and go to other states, they therefore fall under the purview of the federal government because the Constitution says that the federal government can regulate trade between the states. It actually says only the federal government can regulate trade. So they use that to put in provisions so that factories who employ kids, I think the law is not less than 14, and between 14 and 16 only up to 8 hours a day. On your list you've got two people, Kat and Alice Paul. Alice Paul shows up on the test. What I wanted you to know is this is about the 19th Amendment. It was also a progressive era reform giving women the right to vote. Kat follows in on the ideas of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton from 1848. And she's been building the right to vote on a state-by-state basis, but it's been slow. It's slowing down. Alice Paul, here's the radical thing she does. She says, let's not go state by state, but let's go for a federal amendment to the Constitution. And she finally gets Wilson to agree to it, but she goes out and starts picketing the White House and saying pretty bad things about the president during the time of war. She gets thrown in jail, all this stuff. But we finally have an amendment go out to the states for ratification. Now, these states won't do it. The southern states, they won't vote for women. They don't think the women are qualified to vote. Tennessee's a swing vote. We end up going with it. Tennessee's always been kind of a swing. We don't know if we're progressive Democrats or if we're conservative, or progressive Republicans for that matter too.